welcome everyone to the fourth edition of Global Report. We're happy to let you know that today we have our first guest, who I understand has even listened to the first three episodes in preparation. And we're really excited to have her here because, like so much of what we see in the news and so much of what Morgan and I follow in the news, she has some expertise, like so many of the people here in Washington, and like something that's been very much in the news. And so we're really forward to having a good conversation today. I know Tanya Munson from my work with the Libyan American Alliance, with whom she has also worked. She holds a BA in economics and psychology from Binghamton University in New York and a JD from Columbus School of Law at Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., focusing on human rights and national security. Tanya has worked in the Office of Military Commissions and Department of Defense on matters related to trials of high-value detainees in Guantanamo Bay. Tanya also worked in the Civil Division, Environment and Natural Resources Division, Department of Justice, and as a legal education author. I can also add that neither of us is representing Libyan American Alliance today. I'm not representing American University. She's not representing whoever else she's working with these days, Department of Justice or anybody else, and she can tell you more about that. But I think we'd like to open today with Tanya, just to give us an idea of what you do and what you're working on now related to some of the things we'd like to discuss today.
Thank you for that introduction. So since my background, like you mentioned, is in economics and psychology, something that has always interested me is sanctions, because they both come into play. And I'm also interested in humanitarian law. And so that's what I've been focusing on with my career. And with the Libyan American Alliance, the work that I've done specifically has been on advocating for sanctions to be imposed upon individuals, and as well as using the court system to hold individuals accountable for human rights abuses. And there's a lot of work to be done. And especially in 2024 now, there is a lot of human rights abuses, unfortunately, taking place. And so there's an increased burden on civil society to advocate for accountability and holding individuals accountable.
Before we jump over to Russia, you've worked a lot in sort of new areas of law where people in the United States can sue people overseas who've done crimes overseas, and not just against U.S. citizens overseas, but against foreign nationals. Could you just tell us, sort of for the general listener, a little bit why this is even possible?
So the lawsuit that I mainly focus on is the Torture Victims Protection Act. And that was a statute that was created in the early 90s. And it's a United States law that fulfills the country's obligations under the United Nations Charter. And it expands and enhances on the Alien Tort Statute. And so this law holds individuals who have alleged to have committed human rights abuses, such as torture or extrajudicial killings, while acting in an official capacity for a foreign nation. Individuals are allowed to bring suit against them in the United States court systems. But a caveat of that is that they have to have exhausted all adequate and available remedies in the country where the alleged offenses were to have taken place. And the individuals bringing the suit don't need to be American citizens, so that it gives a revenue for people that were not able to receive justice in their home countries to hold those individuals accountable in the United States court system.
And these are civil, not criminal.
Yeah, these are civil suits.
Not criminal. And just again, these can be non-American citizens suing non-American citizens for things that didn't happen in the United States. What does have to be connected to the U.S.? Does the person have to be a resident in the U.S.?
No, there's no residency requirement for this. The stipulation is just that they have to have gone through the entire court system in their home country, and they could need to have proof that they have used all available remedies.
And what stops people from just frivolously suing? Some some Chinese person suing some Chinese company, or some Chinese, perpetration against Uyghurs that really has no connection to the U.S. Maybe the word frivolous isn't right, but just something just completely disconnected from, let's say, the legal issues that the American system is concerned with. So like a
I think that,
truly disconnected thing,
yeah, the element that ties to the United States interests is that the defendant in this suit needs to be somebody that was acting in an actual or apparent official capacity of this foreign country. And so
Yeah.
that's where the interest in holding them accountable tie in, because they're acting in that capacity for that nation. So you can't sue just somebody who's wronged you in a business deal. It has to be somebody that was acting in that capacity and alleged to have either committed torture or extrajudicial killing. So those are two big hurdles to come over that kind of eliminates the same possibility of frivolous suits.
And even though the law is since the 1990s, it seems like most of the action's been in the last 10 years or so. Could you say why there's sort of a pickup in recent years under this new set of legal frames or opportunities?
I don't want to say that it's because there are more human rights abuses.
You can.
But that's definitely an element, as well as some of the wording and the language of the statute has been amended and expanded. And as more court cases become precedent, then it becomes more easily predictable if you have a legitimate case and what process you need to go through and which elements you need to prove. And so it makes it easier to know whether or not you could have success in the court system.
And I cut you off earlier. You were about to start talking about a second case.
Oh, I was going to mention the second statute that is somewhat relevant, but that I don't work with because it is very new. And that is a criminal statute, and that's the Justice for War Crimes Act, Victims of War Crimes Act. And that was enacted in January of 2023. And it expands on the War Crimes Act of 1996. And it gives the United States courts jurisdiction over war crimes that there's no statute of limitations on. And so any person that steps foot in the United States is subject to jurisdiction under this statute. And there does not have to be a connection to the United States involved in this at all, where in other statutes that have to be involving a United States citizen or a national or some sort of connection with the United States, this isn't a requirement at all in this statute. And this just requires there to be a public interest in prosecuting, and there has to be a determination that it's necessary to secure substantial justice, and it's certification that's provided by the Attorney General. And since this is such a new statute, there's only been one case that has been brought, and that was against, I believe it was 3 Russian individuals. And the Attorney General has made statements vowing to use the statute more, and that the first case is just one of many. And so hopefully we are going to see an increase in those in the months and years to come.
So I think, based on the work you're doing, there's sort of this direct link into human rights law and prosecutions in the United States as a result of sanctions, because really most of those cases are coming from countries that we presumably sanctioned, because that's where the bad things are going on. So can you speak to sort of what has evolved in Russia since 2014, since the first invasion of Ukraine, to today, post second invasion of Ukraine, how those sorts of things are starting to evolve from a sanctions standpoint and also sort of a human rights standpoint?
Yeah, so the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, has been sanctioning individuals from Russia for many years now because of human rights abuses and sponsoring those abuses. But in more recent time, just earlier last month, the Biden administration announced 500 more sanctions on Russia. And that's coming on top of hundreds of sanctions from before, as well as from the international community. There's thousands of sanctions in place on both individuals and corporations and companies associated with Russia. And as Russia's more on the forefront of international concern, there's more pressure to impose these sanctions, even though some argue that they have kind of diminishing returns as more sanctions are enforced. The effectiveness of them kind of declines over time. But as more countries are imposing these sanctions, more are encouraged to do so as well. So there has been that momentum increasing to impose those sanctions. And it's not just on individuals and it's not just on corporations, but also on individuals, and individuals that own more than 50% of a corporation are blocked from doing business and transacting with the United States.
Yeah, I think what's interesting to have seen evolved sort of in the sanctions toolkit over the past 20, 30 years. We're kind of used to these blanket sanctions where we would target an entire country. And I think, the studies showed over time that you were really penalizing, innocent civilians from having access to things and not really doing any damage to the regimes responsible for the bad actions. So I know, of course, in recent years, we've sort of gone from this broad sanctions tool set to a more targeted sanctions regime. But does that then make it more difficult to prosecute individuals responsible? Or in your view, does that sort of improve the effectiveness of actually going after those select individuals?
Well, I think that the opinions on that may differ, but the increasing the targeted sanctions and imposing them on individuals, the sentiment behind that is for Russia specifically, those that are allied with Putin and the Kremlin are more personally responsible, and now they're having their assets and super yachts taken, and so they're hopefully more inclined to defect, but they're left with the choice of all or nothing. It's not that they can cut ties and still continue living their life. It's they have to completely separate themselves from the situation. That's unlikely to happen for these oligarchs and billionaires that are being targeted. And with the blanket sanctions, that, like you said, the impact is on the individuals in the countries. Those are the ones that are suffering from not being able to use the financial institutions and having to pay different prices for things. And that is something that a lot of these leaders don't care as much about, because they're focused on their goals and objectives and not as much about the people in their country, which unfortunately is the case. But these targeted sanctions have the goal of making them, whether they want to or not, feel more responsibility and more personal responsibility for their actions. And so when it's their assets that are being targeted, that's hopefully the objective.
Yeah, I know, for example, in Libya and Syria, the sanctions are still pretty broad. And so citizens are still sort of having a direct impact from those sanctions regimes. Now, in those sort of situations where there's really no legal remedy in those countries based on a flawed justice system, how do you allow those individuals, for example, to use the U.S. court system to bring about prosecution? Or does an individual's case sort of fall out if the U.S., for example, is already going after that individual?
Well, to be anecdotal, a case that I've worked on is against the Libyan warlord Khalifa Haftar, and that is a suit that we brought under the TVPA in both in Virginia and DC. And that is an individual who we believe should be sanctioned. But the accountability that us as civil society can do is to help individuals bring these cases. But unfortunately, it's not really an option for the average individual in these countries to go through the entire legal system, which is often corrupt and just really difficult to actually go through and kind of attempt to litigate. And also it's difficult for them to have that connection to the United States and to find the people to represent them. And there's language barriers, there's transportation and communication issues, and so it's a lot of just really like administrative things that are difficult for an average person to do. And there are a lot of people that have very similar unfortunate stories that aren't able to receive that kind of restitution, and they can't pursue the legal remedies. And so kind of the best that they could hope for is for them to be sanctioned by the government, because at the end of the day, if they're sued in the United States, only the United States assets that they have are at jeopardy. And so if the country sanctions them, then those assets get frozen, and it's kind of the same situation. And if they don't have any assets, then not much that can be done from the court side of things.
So I know with Russia, we just had another recent round of sanctions announced in reaction to Navalny's death, which was very tragic. Are these additional sanctions going to do anything, or is it more of just a show of sympathy? Do you see this latest round having real effects on those individuals who were targeted?
Well, they definitely have a symbolic effect. The acknowledgement of that something bad has happened and we care about it. And so just from that point of view is that they have that, like, it's redirecting the attention to, pressing issues, and that we shouldn't, lose concern over this. But from the practical aspect, it's still split opinions on whether or not there's immediate beneficial effects of these. I think that the effects of these sanctions will be more prevalent in the long term. In the short term, there's different ways to get around sanctions and to avoid the impacts, and using different companies and in different countries to circumnavigate the impacts. But as time goes on and these companies are discovered and targeted as well, then it becomes harder to work around these. But at the same time, as more sanctions are put in place, they're getting better at avoiding them and knowing how to go about flying under the radar and using these shell companies to kind of avoid any repercussions. But in the long term, the economy is going to feel the effect of these sanctions, whether it be from other countries' responses to them or from the direct economic impacts. And so just for an example of India importing oil, they have been getting it at a discount, so they have been importing more. It means that it seems like the economy is doing well. But in the long term, that's one revenue spike. That's not an indication of the economy's health. And over time, as it becomes more constricted, the economy is going to shrink, and countries like India are going to be deterred from importing that cheap oil because of the sanctions and the implications of doing so.
I have a quick follow-up on that question. So there's an argument that sanctions help make black markets worse. And I'll use the India example, right? So Russia has a bunch of rupees, a bunch of extra rupees. They really can't convert it back to Russian currency. And so you hear all this talk about BRICS and alternative sanctions that are sort of immune from US sanctions, and that whole development, the BRIC currency. So, is there a risk over the longer term that if the US just keeps sanctioning widely around the world, and the effects of secondary sanctions and all this, that we sort of push a lot of the world economy into areas we can't reach anymore, including pushing countries to de-dollarize because we've pushed so much economic activity outside of the reach of US sanctions?
I think those risks are definitely there, and it's hard to predict what the responses will be from the global economy. And it's just kind of the hope that won't happen. But it's also the sanctions are, for the most part, kind of limited in what difference they're doing. And so since they're kind of repeating the same things and attempting to do a death by a thousand cuts situation,
Yep.
I don't know if more are going to create that different response and that motivation to de-dollarize and to shift. But I think it's just going to be a waiting game to see what the reaction will be.
For anyone that wants to delve into that further, there was a recent event at Carnegie about a month ago, and the conclusion of the panel was it won't happen anytime soon, and there are ways to keep it from happening. But they were saying definitely what Tanya just said, it's a definite risk. In terms of just sanctions in general, I know that you said you could say something about types of sanctions. When I think of sanctions, I think of the Russia sanction baskets, or basket, the Iranian sanction basket, the Caesar sanctions and Syria and all that. Can you just say a little bit more about the different types of sanctions from your perspective?
Well, I think the biggest types of sanctions are the targeted versus non-targeted, where the non-targeted ones are the blanket sanctions across the entire country and the entire economy, where the targeted ones are on individuals. And they have different impacts. The non-targeted ones, I think some people believe those to be less effective than the targeted ones, because the non-targeted ones are just more general, where the targeted ones that are hitting corporations directly and individuals personally, that those are going to have more of an effect rather than just a general sanction on the country broadly. And so the targeted ones allow for more direct response. And so those are I think the two biggest different types of sanctions.
Can you give some examples? Yeah, could you give some examples of when sanctions have been really effective or the most effective?
So there's a lot of examples in history of times that sanctions have been really impactful, and I think that one that you might have some perspective on is the disarmament of Libya and the denuclearization. And that was something that was really encouraged by United States sanctions, and attempting to restore relations was one of the motivating factors of trying to resolve the situation. And another one that comes to mind is ending apartheid in South Africa was instigated through the threat of sanctions and the desire to get rid of sanctions. So those are the two big ones that come to mind, but as well as just broadly, a lot of the sanctions in the Middle East have also been very effective.
So I've worked directly on 3 types of sanctions in my life, and you just mentioned 2 of them. I was deeply involved in the divestment movement on South Africa. I was deeply involved in all the programs in Libya that were part of the reorienting of scientists, for example, as part of the carrot side of that whole Libya disarmament, including nuclear scientists who I worked directly on developing those programs. I was also involved in, after the JCPOA vis-a-vis Iran, helping companies navigate the residual sanctions on Iran, which have now not only been all reestablished, but sort of doubled down on, particularly by the United States after the U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA. But one of the things I learned from that third experience was how even when let's say there's the sanctions detente, like under the JCPOA, there was a lot of residual sanctioning stuff going on. And also secondary sanctions have a massive impact and can sort of freeze economic activity, even when their companies aren't necessarily directly related to the sanctions. I don't know if that discussion triggers any response or comment from you.
I don't have any specific response or comment, but it's always interesting to hear about how you have experience with almost everything that comes to mind.
Yeah. Well, I think what's interesting about that, Bill, is how different these countries are, right?
Yeah.
Like Russia is so vastly different from Libya or South Africa, excuse me, in terms of size, scope, what they supply. I think compared to 50 years ago, looking at sanctions history, there's a lot more developed countries a lot more consumer economies across the globe. When sanctions were most effective is when the U.S. had a lot of buying power, a lot more might than it perhaps does today, in contrast. And so I think it's hard to say that sanctions are necessarily ineffective overall, but they certainly are being challenged in their effectiveness in this Russia case. We talked a little bit about the oil imports to India, right, for example. So when we decided to sanction Russia, we said we're going to stop maritime activity. We're not going to use Russian oil anymore. And Russia said, great, we're going to go into the open market. We're going to participate like any other country does. And they've since gobbled up 600 to 700 vessels and stuck them into what we now call the dark fleet. And so all they've done is used market economics to participate and engage. And they've really spun up this wartime economic engine and simply shifted their economic activity. And because we have so many more consumer economies around the world who depend upon these energy resources, it's been easy for them to shift things around. If you look back at oil prices, it was really a whip effect. It shot prices up for a couple months, and then they quickly figured out this scheme, how to divert everything, and prices shot back down because supply was kept in order. So it's hard to say how effective sanctions are when we've got this like extreme case that we're not used to, right? Because Russia's such a large economy. Another interesting point that I was looking into was when Putin came to power about 20 years ago, Russia was in a much different economic state than it was today in terms of what it actually produces. So 20 years ago, Russia was importing a lot of basic food goods, and now they're actually a huge exporter of those same food goods that they were previously importing. So there's sort of this resilience that they've established over 20 years that sort of contrasts to, had this happened 20 years ago, the impacts of these sanctions might look a lot different.
Could I piggyback off of that and ask a question? So Putin killed Prigozhin, right? And I know you were directly involved in the case in DC courts against Prigozhin, but now Prigozhin's dead. And I was wondering if you could talk about the status of that lawsuit and also the Wagner Group in general. They've acted nefariously in about 8 countries in Africa now where they're active. Other countries they've left in Syria, in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, and other theaters around the globe. And just the whole issue also of private military contractors, whether American or foreign, and sort of how you go after them in the context of non-state actors acting as state actors.
Yeah, so Prigozhin's always a fun topic of conversation for me, given that, I was involved in the lawsuit against him. And I think that they just got so terrified that they had to take him out. They heard that we were suing him, and they were like, oh, this guy's no good.
See, you have more power in the world than anyone here in this conversation.
Yeah.
But thoughts on all of that, yeah.
Yeah, something interesting about Prigozhin in the sanctions realm is that the United States has actually sanctioned him for various activities from years ago, including interference in the 2016 election. And so he's been identified as a target of sanctions for some time. And so his involvement in the group just kind of reiterated the importance of sanctioning him. But the Treasury did designate the Wagner Group, or Wagner Group, however German you want to get with the name, as a transnational criminal organization. And so that froze all of its United States assets. But with an organization like that, they're going to use different countries and different companies to hide their assets. And so while they're not permitted to conduct any business with the United States, they don't really need to because of all their business that's happening in just so many different countries abroad.
Yeah. And you're having to refile the case though because he's dead now. So explain that?
So with the TVPA, you cannot sue an organization. It has to be a suit against an individual. So you can't just substitute in the next leader of the Wagner Group as the next defendant. You need to use somebody from Prigozhin's estate if you want to substitute him. And so the current dilemma is who's going to be the substitute and who's going to be kind of his fill-in. And so just trying to find all that information has been a little bit of a holdup, but that's where that's at.
And then Wagner Group in general, you started to talk about that, but they're a non-state actor acting as a state actor. How does that? What's your legal mind think when I raise that issue?
That my legal mind thinks that's complicated. An intern should do that work, but that's it makes things really difficult for trying to either treat them as a corporation or as a government official. And so when these individuals are acting in a pseudo-official capacity, it makes it frustrating because you can't properly identify them as a foreign official until you have that kind of proof that they are acting in that capacity. But with the Wagner Group's dealings, they're also shady and behind the scenes, and you're getting glimpses of handshakes, but there's nothing that's solid and on paper, and that's like hard proof of their involvement in government affairs.
And can you also distinguish between civil versus criminal? Because these are all civil, the ones you've been talking about that you've been involved in. Why civil, not criminal? What's the law on that?
Yeah, so regular civilians cannot bring criminal lawsuits typically, and so they're mostly limited to the civil side of things. And so the government is the one that's responsible for bringing the criminal suits, such as under the Justice for Victims of War Crime Act.
Morgan, do you have another question or two? I think we're probably getting towards near the end of our time, but I'm sure you've got a few more.
Yeah, I'm interested in the sanctions on the Wagner Group and kind of how those apply and how those are actually prosecuted. I think a lot of times the U.S. tries to set up these traps through the sanctions, and it really the trap initiates when there's sort of a financial transaction using, for example, the U.S. banking system, because money around the world is so dependent upon the U.S. dollar, and money makes multiple moves before it goes from one bank to the other, oftentimes getting routed through a U.S. bank. That's sort of how we're able to snag or catch on to individuals that are sanctioned. How is that going to work with the Wagner Group? Is it going to be related to specific crimes, or will it sort of work like a financial trap, for example, where if something gets routed through a shell company, there's sort of this touch on U.S. That then you can go after individuals involved in the whole group?
Yeah, so since the sanctions, they're the main thing that they do is they freeze assets. The assets have to be associated with a financial institution in the United States somehow. So I think that the main thing that the United States relies on for these sanctions to be effective is by encouraging other countries to impose similar sanctions and by leading as an example. And so because the Wagner Group has all these assets, mostly in Europe and abroad, those countries are the ones that we are hoping to also implement these sanctions and to kind of narrow down the revenues that they have to go through that are safe. And so the EU has imposed sanctions on the Wagner Group as well as individuals for their human rights violations. And so when there's more of these sanctions in more countries, then it's more likely that those assets will be frozen and unable to be used, and the impact is more tangible. And so as more countries are imposing these sanctions, it's kind of a ripple effect of more countries want to do it because the financial transactions might be routed elsewhere. So when there's less paths to take, then there's more potential for negative consequences.
Yeah, I think one of the other issues from the financial perspective has really been the non-transparency in corporate ownership. For example, of shell companies. I think one of the interesting things the U.S. is sort of working on, and I was following it, and I don't know if they had fully implemented the rules yet or the guidance, but sort of this idea of beneficial ownership, ultimate ownership of corporate stock. So, for example, in certain cases, corporations in the U.S., for example, will have to report their ultimate ownership, who the individuals are that actually own the stock. I think one of the benefits to transnational crime is sort of that individuals get to own stock in a company, and there's no sort of piercing of that corporate veil. And so it's just the shell company name, and we don't know who owns it, and vice versa, unless you have things like the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers, where all that information gets leaked out, millions of documents. But I think that's sort of a global issue. How can countries work together to sort of increase corporate transparency? I think that would be like a really vital and easy tool that would help uncover these things.
And I have to say, I've learned from my experience in Libya and other contexts, and this is the Libya Scientist Program, not the Libya other stuff that we were talking about, that you need a lot of carrots and sticks. That when you're dealing with corruption, when you're dealing with malfeasance, when you're dealing with all the things for which we need more accountability, the punitive act of sanctions only, the ICJ and ICC type actions, which we didn't talk about as much today, all of those, I've learned, it's not my view, it's my experience, can't work if you're not building up other mechanisms to sort of incentivize people to do the right things. And that's why we spent so much time with the Libyan nuclear scientists and others orienting them towards better activities. It was done with the same organization I was working with, CRDF, with the Russian scientists, which was another successful program that we did after the Cold War in a number of countries that have been in the Soviet Union. So all of that to say that the punitive only approach just doesn't work in international affairs. That's the simple way to say it. Morgan, are we? I think we're at our time, or do you have one more?
I think that's it for me. This has been a fun discussion. I don't have much experience or background in human rights law and things like that. So it was so interesting to hear it in the context of sanctions, and really appreciate you, Tanya, taking the time to come in, and thanks for all the work that you do.
Well, thanks
Tanya
for letting me be
go-to people, and yep.
Thanks for letting me be the inaugural guest.
Yes. No, it's been really great having her, and she's one of my go-to people on this set of issues here in Washington. And if I've learned anything else in my multi-decade career in international affairs, if you're not talking to the lawyers, you don't know what you're talking about. Because the fundamental aspect of international relations is international law. It's like behind everything. It doesn't always rear its pretty face or ugly face, in the press coverage of international law, but it's at the heart of everything that happens in international affairs. So again, kudos to you, Tanya, for all that you do, and I hope you have a lot more success in this area.
Thank you.